good? You get to that lesson. What's going on here? Hang in there, buddy. Gold mining, yeah. It's a gold mining family. Remember, mining is going to be big business out west, even beyond the gold rush of 1849. There's even larger gold rush, silver rush in places like Park City, Utah, and Carson City, Nevada. In fact, we're going to see like a massive turn of the century Yukon gold rush in Alaska as well. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in lesson 2 is the clash of cultures on the plains. Keep in mind, Native Americans were the largest number of inhabitants out in the Western Territories, west of the Mississippi and east of the Pacific. So after the Civil War, it's a largely untamed area, and the largest groups of people that are out there, a lot of different Native American tribes, a lot of Mexican settlers that are migrating, Mestizo, Tejano, a lot of Mormons had traveled out and settled in Utah by this point. A lot of wildlife, massive buffalo herds bring a lot of people out there, especially Civil War veterans, to become buffalo hunters. Native Americans are sort of caught in a rock and a hard place between really their own native traditions and the push west of white settlers, right? And the building of what the natives called the Iron Horse, right? By this period of time, the first transcontinental rail line is going to be completed, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific that meet at Promontory Point, Utah, and 4 additional lines will be developed by the turn of the century. So something that brings a lot of people out west is to work on the railroad or to benefit from work on the railroad. We'll talk more about that during the Industrial Revolution. We'll get into that, or the Second Industrial Revolution as we move into the semester. Keep in mind, this is not some monolithic sort of utopian in the West. Not all Native American tribes get along. In fact, their rivalries and their sort of their own clash of cultures, so to speak, predate the rivalries between them and the federal government at this time. So an example would be the Comanche and the Apache. A lot of them have adapted though. Like for example, the Sioux were expert horsemen by this time. Remember, they had indirectly been introduced to the horse by what country? Spain. Spain, very good. And they've become really effective buffalo hunters, but Sioux war parties and hunting parties on horseback were lethal. A lot of disease is going to be spread, killing Native Americans in the West at this period of time. So we're talking, yellow fever, we're talking horrible epidemics during this era. I talked a bit about the buffalo. All parts of the buffalo are used by the Native Americans, but all parts of the buffalo are also going to be used by buffalo hunters that are coming out, not only for hides, but to sell, parts of the horns, the meat, the entrails. There's just all types of big business to move buffalo back east. And really, it's really sad because the buffalo are going to end up, as a protected, nearly extinct, endangered species in America in this post-buffalo hunter era. We also want to look at treaties that are going to be broken throughout. I don't want to make it confusing. It's probably going to seem confusing, but the Fort Laramie treaties, there are a number of them that are passed. This is a federal fort on the border of Wyoming, Nebraska, and South Dakota. It exists in Wyoming, and these are basically agreements for a system of reservations for tribes that will not be touched by the federal government. So on the top left here, we have Fort Laramie. top right, the buffalo hunters, bottom left, the Sioux hunting party, and then this is what the Sioux reservation looked like through the Fort Laramie Treaty that was passed in 1868. If you take a look right here, that right there, like right in that area, that's where Fort Laramie is, right there. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about the clash of the cultures here. Native Americans weren't too interested in learning about the government's way of doing business. Do keep in mind that these Native American tribes and these people were left out of the Constitution. They had no protected rights. They weren't even citizens in the eyes of the United States, which is quite ironic. The way business was done with chiefs was really shady, because one chief might not be representing an entire tribe. There might be a chief that represented a portion of a tribe, or a chief that represented a portion of a confederation. And the federal government was not interested in, learning how that power structure was broken down. So they might get a chief to sign a treaty that might be advantageous for that chief and part of his tribe, and they might take advantage of them in that situation. Another problem that Native Americans are going to grapple with during this era and are still grappling with in their reservation societies are alcoholism. A lot of the alcohol is going to be introduced to Native Americans obviously as early as the colonial era, and they're going to suffer horribly from that. A lot of the Native Americans, when signing these treaties, they were expecting aid. They thought they were going to get the aid through groups like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but it turned out that it was just a corrupt bargain, because they didn't get the food, they didn't get the supplies, they didn't get the funding, they didn't get the land grant. If you look at every single treaty signed with Native Americans in this era, every single one of them were broken by the federal government, period. So really the Western Indian Wars start in 1864, and they're going to end in 1890. That's going to be the era. What we're looking at, battles, some small skirmishes, but mainly what it is massacres on both sides, but more so inflicted by the federal government on Native American tribes. There are going to be a couple of different weapons that are going to turn the tide in favor of the federal government and white settlers moving forward, and that's going to be the Colt revolver, the Colt 45, and the Henry and Winchester repeating rifles. Prior to the Civil War, a smoothbore musket or a rifled musket, even a Springfield or an infield rifled musket with a mini ball with a combustion chamber on the bottom, Sioux arrow would have been more efficient than that rifle, because you would have had to have used powder, you would have had to have used the ball, you had to ram it home, and you would have had to have used, like, a combustion or compression cap, right? That was all sort of like cutting edge. But by the end of the Civil War, you actually have a metal cartridge bullet that you can load into a revolver. You can load these metal cartridge bullets into lever action rifles, and those guns truly win the West. That is not a lot of times we say that like sort of like tongue in cheek, oh, the gun that won the West. The Colt 45 and the Henry and Winchester repeating rifles certainly won the West. Large number of cavalry and army are headed out west, and this is an interesting group that I wanted to highlight, because they're one of the most conflicted groups that are serving during this era, and then the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. A lot of these African American men had served in the Civil War or outright knew that they had gained their freedom by fighting for the Union Army, or the victory of the Union Army allowed for the passage of the 13th Amendment, and now they themselves are in a very tough position to be moved out west to take away the rights of Native Americans. And a lot of these guys are going to write in journals and diaries about this moral conflict. So the Western Indian Wars really begin on November 29th, 1864. I mean, I guess we could say, well, wait a minute, what about the fighting before the Civil War out west? You know, yeah, there was fighting, but this is like the post sort of into the Civil War Indian Wars that end up putting all Native Americans on reservations, or, you know, putting them in a situation where they have to give up on their tribal way of life. And it occurs when Colonel J.M. Shivington, cavalry colonel, and his cavalry detachment circle and kill 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho in what is known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sioux, who will have an alliance with a confederation with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, are going to strike revenge on the Bozeman Trail at the Fetterman Massacre. The Bozeman Trail went through the Sioux's reservation that had been agreed upon in an earlier treaty, and Captain William J. Fetterman and 81 U.S. soldiers will be killed in this particular battle, skirmish, massacre, however you want to call it. The Fetterman Massacre leads to the restructuring of the earlier Geneva. Oh, it's all good. All right, walk around if you need to. The Fetterman Massacre leads to a restructuring of the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868, which gives the Sioux control of the Bozeman Trail, and it drew the map that we just took a look at, shaded in green. But just 6 years later, in 1874, gold's going to be discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, on the border of South Dakota and Wyoming, and this is on Sioux territory. Another cavalry detachment is going to be sent out on a geological expedition to move the Sioux out of the Black Hills, led by Colonel George Armstrong Custer. He was one of the staff officers that was present at Appomattox Courthouse with Ulysses Grant. So we have Custer here on the left. Beautiful picture of the Black Hills in South Dakota, Buffalo. Moving from pasture across the creek there. And what this leads to is the Battle of Little Bighorn, all the way through the Apache Wars. So Little Bighorn occurs on June 25th, 26th, 1876. This is also known as Custer's Last Stand. It's really the turning point of the Western Indian Wars, because once Custer and his 700 soldiers are killed in this particular battle that they initiated, this is when the government was going to beef up the military reinforcements in the West. So the Native American Sioux are led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. They refuse to give up their land on the Little Bighorn in the Black Hills. Custer led an attack on Little Bighorn Creek with 700 U.S. soldiers, mostly from the 7th Cav, and they battled Crazy Horse, who was labeled hostile. What they faced was 10,000 Sioux and Sioux Confederated natives, and about 1,800 of those were Sioux warriors. All of Custer's detachment, including himself, who they called Chief Yellowhair, were killed. Again, keep in mind that the Sioux was in a pretty, bless you, solid confederation of the Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Northern Cheyenne. So again, the United States government is going to seek revenge, and this really seals the fate of the peaceful or broken treaties prior to the Fort Laramie treaties prior to the events at Little Bighorn. The Nez Perce, who we talked about all the way back in the first semester with Lewis and Clark, they were led by Chief Joseph. They revolted against the government. They totally bugged out, refused to adhere to demands to be confined to a reservation, and they lived over 1,700 miles through the northern Rockies to the border of Canada. They were eventually caught and defeated at the Battle of Bear Paw Mountain, about 40 miles from the Canadian border in the northern portion of the Rockies. Chief Joseph buried the hatchet, and this ultimately led the Nez Perce to be sent to reservations in Kansas, just north of Oklahoma territory, the Indian reservations, where 40% died from disease. The Apache Wars were led by Geronimo. He was a pretty wily adversary for the U.S. military forces. These battles against the Apache, this was not a new issue. The Apache and the Comanche had fought against government military detachments prior to the American Civil War. These particular battles, they went all the way into Mexico until Geronimo and other Apache leaders were eventually caught, jailed, and later released. And here's some other things that really will do the Native Americans in. The movement and building of railroads to the west, large-scale diseases, lack of buffalo, large-scale warfare, the loss of their land, broken treaties, and the fact that they're completely left out of the Constitution. I mean, even when they tried to go to the courts, the decisions were never upheld to protect their rights. Yeah, sure, of course. So here on the left, we have Crazy Horse. On the right, Sitting Bull. This is a famous lithograph by Charles Marion Russell of the Custer fight, the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is a map of the engagement of Custer and the Sioux on the Little Bighorn. And this is an interesting photo. It's Geronimo in a 1905 Locomobile Model C. It was a car company that was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were defunct, I think, by the early 1920s. They got absorbed by one of the guys from General Motors, and then that company ended up falling apart as the Depression came around. We'll talk about why a lot of the car companies didn't make it. We actually had a really famous car company right here in Richmond that was over near the Diamond that didn't make it through the Great Depression. So Geronimo's here driving. He's wearing the top hat. He was after he was released, he starts to participate in Wild West shows. He is paid to attend events like the Chicago World's Fair. So how is he sort of viewed by a lot of the tribal members, do you think? Yeah, he's kind of a sellout to a lot of them. I think that you've got to look at Geronimo's history objectively. He tried to use his celebrity and fame to provide wealth and opportunity for his family and tribal members. It's a weird legacy for sure. The massacre at Wounded Knee. This is officially the end of the Western Indian Wars. You keep in mind that people are getting a pretty good idea of the plight and subjugation of these tribes. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote A Century of Dishonor, outlining all of the broken treaties and the corruption and the lack of rights Native Americans had. She also wrote a fictional novel that highlighted this as well, known as Ramona. Native Americans faced a really difficult decision: join the modern times, stick with traditional ways, or try to figure out how to assimilate and keep traditions, but also walk the white man's road, so to speak. But again, there were some really tough issues going on. They're losing ancestral land. Missionaries have gone out west to try to Christianize them, and word has gotten back that both the Sundance and the Ghost Dance, these were peaceful ceremonial dances performed by mostly the Lakota, but a number of other tribes from the Dakotas all the way to California. It became outlawed by the government, which was also ironic because that should have been protected in the First Amendment, but keep in mind none of their rights are protected by the Constitution or the First Amendment. So on December 29, 1890, there was a religious ghost dance taking place by the Sioux. They were surrounded by U.S. military forces, mostly cavalry. Someone in the tribe accidentally fired a shot, and this gave them grounds to open up fire, massacring more than 200 men, women, and children, essentially killed for performing the ghost dance. And by now, Native Americans were either on reservations, dead, or had to conform to a set of laws that are going to be passed, known as the Dawes Severalty Acts. Here on the left, we have A Century of Dishonor by Helen Hunt Jackson, and on the right, this is a very difficult image to look at. These are images taken as a result of the Battle of Wounded Knee. The ground was so frozen that they couldn't bury the bodies. And this is where we're going to wrap up for the day. Hang in there with me, please. The Dawes Severalty Acts, passed into law by the Massachusetts congressman that sponsored the bill. This is basically an Americanization type law passed in 1887. Part of the reason that the massacre of Wounded Knee occurred is because the Sundance and the Ghost Dance were outlawed through the Dawes Acts. The goal is this: erase tribes and erase Native American culture by through land allotments and public school programs to try to Americanize Native American children. So it also created a citizenship, a pathway to citizenship that Native Americans, if they took the land allotments and they were willing to move away from their tribal ways, they would be able to become citizens. But it's another layer of irony, because it's going to take Native Americans a quarter of a century to get citizenship through the Dawes Severalty Acts, when Irish and Italian immigrants and Russian immigrants and Greek immigrants and all these immigrants are flooding into Ellis Island and Angel Island, and their pathway to citizenship is much quicker. Obviously, that's not the case for the Chinese at this period of time, but for the most part, most immigrant groups were able to gain citizenship pretty quickly in this era. Yes, correct. And it leads to what is called the Carlisle Indian Schools. They were established in places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to Americanize Native American kids. The most famous graduate of the Carlisle schools was Jim Thorpe, one of the greatest and most well-recognized American athletes in sports history. He won multiple Olympic gold medals in several different events. He was a professional football player, professional baseball player, professional basketball player, but he also has kind of a tarnished legacy. He had a really tough bout with alcoholism, but he also went out and sort of went against the Carlisle school motto, kill the Indian, save the child. By the time Thorpe got famous, he starts to say, no, maintain your culture, take advantage of the opportunity, but maintain your culture. The Dawes Acts really, on a large scale, kind of do the job they set out to do. By 1900, Native Americans only held 50% of the land that they had 20 years prior. And the Dawes Acts will be rewritten through a Reorganization Act, in 1934 that allowed for Native Americans to sort of have their own New Deal, and it forced, sort of like it allowed for Native Americans to obtain their cultural identity, and it moved away from the hardcore assimilation tactics. That bill was called the Wheeler-Howard Act. And here we have Jim Thorpe. This guy's so famous, he has a town in Pennsylvania named after him. Also, the Collegiate Award for Top Defensive Back is the Thorpe Award. So he's, again, a very interesting legacy for Jim Thorpe.